Today, I want to go over part of an interview with Chris Hedges and expert on fascism, Jason Stanley. He's written numerous books from How Fascism Works, How Propaganda Works, and his recent book, Erasing History, where he talks about how fascism really seeks to rewrite the past so they can control the future. So let's get straight into the interview.
Let's begin with the piece you had in The Guardian, where you quite specifically talk about like Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, and how all of these things, well, that's already pretty much been dismantled by the Supreme Court, but how all of these things are being dismantled and why.
So, first of all, Title VI isn't being dismantled, it's being weaponized. It's being reversed and weaponized. And the way it's being weaponized is it's being directed to fight supposed anti-white discrimination. So this regime is following Viktor Orban and Viktor Orban focused on Christians, saying Christians were the most persecuted group in the world. Now, this regime is saying whites are the most persecuted group in the world. Of course, Trump signed an executive order giving special status to Afrikaners who supposedly were under threat when actually Afrikaners own, whites own much of the land in South Africa. So this idea that white people are under threat, they're using Title VI to push this. And basically what they're going to do is they're going to say any black people in positions of power that came at the cost of supposedly more competent white Americans, which leans into racist stereotypes baked in to the American past. And then most concerningly for me as a Jewish American is they are using us, Jewish Americans. They're like nakedly using us as an excuse to take down the most Jewish institution in American life, the university.
Well, but they've also, well, you're right, that they've weaponized it, but they've also stripped the protections that it once gave to vulnerable and marginalized people.
Yeah, conceptually. So Title VI is intended to help traditionally marginalized, traditionally oppressed people. But the idea now is that there are no what this group wants to say is there are no power differentials anymore. And so the really oppressed people are the majority group, the dominant group. This gets to my book, How Fascism Works, where I have a chapter called Victimhood. Fascism always relies on portraying the dominant group as victims. So the idea that white Americans are somehow being victimized in the university by sort of critical race theorists. I mean, my department of philosophy at Yale hired our first black tenured professor last year. He started in fall 2024. So, I mean, the level of absurdity, factual absurdity, beggars belief.
You see this here in the UK. I have people in my comments, fascists, far right people saying like, "Oh, there's an ethnic cleansing of the white majority." You go to Bradford or Leicestershire, or they really believe this. They really tie in. They really play into that victim mentality that even though white people are the majority in the UK, 82%, somehow they're losing their country. It's that victim mentality, which is a key component of fascism. And they just ignore it. They just go, no, we're not fascist. This, they act like fascism is this uniquely evil, exceptional, this thing in history, like a blip in history. No, we're seeing this across the world where they say, like Jason Stanley says then, Viktor Orban, the Christian majority are the victims. And even though they've got all the power, all the white people have the power, businesses in the UK, they have the money, they're in parliament, they have the most influence, but immigrants and refugees are the real threat coming in. They have the real power. Muslims have the real power. In what world is that happening? It's not, because it is based on an irrational victimhood mentality, not based on evidence, based on fear mongering, us versus them. And you call it out, and they're like, oh no, far right doesn't exist. fascism died in, 1945. No, it's alive more than ever.
But that's the idea, is to make white people feel like they're victimized. And so you erase the history. So you erase the fact that black people were marginalized in America. You make it illegal to talk about the continuing marginalization by the after effects of housing segregation, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, etc., the current effects. You make
Yeah, and people, they don't want to talk about structural racism. Especially in the UK, they don't want to talk about the colonial past. They get very het up, like, oh, it's in the past. Oh, we shouldn't feel guilty. We like bringing it up. No, we haven't reconciled with our past. We cannot move forward unless we accept the shadows, how the past has kind of created the world we live in, a colonial world embedded in racism. Capitalism was built on racism. And we still see it today. But they're like, oh, no, no, it's all in the past. We're not racist anymore. If anything, we're racist to white people, even though white people have all the power, influence, money, and are more likely to get a job, less likely to be imprisoned, more likely to go to universities, the high, Oxford, Warwick. I mean, but evidence doesn't matter to these people. That's why it's so hard to fight fascism in a way, because it's anti-intellectual, it's anti-empirical. They hate the universities because they're all about science and data and evidence, and they're all about emotions. So you give them the data on immigration, and they go, well, I don't care. I feel it. It's a feeling I have. How do you argue with that? You can't. All you got to do is call it out and make people aware of how fascism isn't a unique thing. It's a bias in the brain that leads you to very dark alleys, and it's a human thing that, like racism, tribalism, but we need to be very aware of it and fight it and go, actually, no, there's a reason why people are turning to fascism. And it's a crisis of capitalism. People are not doing well, so they turn to very dark solutions, which historically have not turned out really well, have they?
you make it illegal to talk about those things, and then you say, okay, look at how white people and Asians are discriminated against. So it all comes, but I think there's also an element of retribution here. Title VI was used against segregated Southern schools and racism in the school districts in the South, and now they're flipping it and they're saying, to the glee of many of their supporters, they're saying, no, the real racism is directed against whites, and it's done by these universities.
We'll go into your book, but when I covered the war in Yugoslavia, I watched Slobodan Milosevic use exactly that tactic of telling the Serbs who controlled what was left of Yugoslavia that they were the victims, and famous speech in Kosovo, I will not let them beat you, I will not let them beat you. But it's exactly the same phenomena.
Yeah, victimhood is what you do is, and this is sort of a mixture of the books now. Is you say, in the past we were the great ones, we created the culture, and we're now being punished for that. We're being punished for our greatness, and we're an existential threat. So it goes together with the great replacement theory narratives. And then what they're going to do is they're saying the schools and universities by representing accurate history, are a challenge to this myth. And in fact, the history itself, what if you read what the Department of Education is saying, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that just teaching Black history accurately uh, would be a Title VI violation. In other words, just teaching, say, redlining and the history of our mortgage laws that result in segregated cities today, it looks like that would be the same as a white professor continuously calling all of their Black students with the worst racial slur.
And we see this in the UK with Reform UK. They want to get rid of critical race theory in universities. What is critical race theory? Basically, a Marxist analysis of historical injustices facing black people, essentially black history. Why are they so threatened against history, against fact, the study of the past? It's because they don't want you to know about it. They don't want you to know the history of the British Empire, what we did in concentration camps in Kenya, in South Africa, what we did in Ireland, what we did in India, and they just want to say, no, we're great. We're great. We were great. We've built everything. They don't want us to know the truth. And people buy into it. It's very exceptionalism in the UK, like it is in America, like many countries, is a very convenient narrative where you can go, yeah, we're great. We have to go back to that past where we were great again. Make America great again. And it's very alluring to a lot of people because that's the simple solution, isn't it? Of we were great once because we had the power, we had the money, we had the influence. If we just go back to that, everything will be okay again. But we can't go back to that. That was in the past. A colonial past that didn't end well for a lot of people. But we don't talk about that. We don't listen to the people, the victims of the colonial era. We just go, oh, well, we just need to stop talking about it, even though we not really talked about it in a meaningful way. And this is going to continue. This debate, these culture wars, racism, our past, it ain't going anywhere until we seriously reconcile what happened. I don't know what kind of reparations, but some kind of formal apology and a recognition that we can't go forward without recognizing how our past influences our future, especially under capitalism and the geopolitical situation we're in right now.
So let's open with your book, Erasing History. I mean, I think the book it does a very good job of explaining why they're making war on the universities. You say authoritarian regimes often find history profoundly threatening. At every opportunity, these regimes find ways of erasing or concealing history in order to consolidate their power. Why is this? Why does history do that? Why does history do that is so disruptive to authority, or what does history do that is so disruptive of authoritarian goals? Perhaps most importantly, it provides multiple perspectives of the past. This is really the underlying, you would argue, the underlying goal of what's happened. It has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It has nothing to do with DEI or critical race theory or anything else. These become the tactics for something far more nefarious.
Yeah. I mean, the department, Linda McMahon, in her final, and the department, her letter about the final mission of the Department of Education says it's going to be to impose patriotic education. Patriotic education being a kind of, flat, one-dimensional story of the greatness of the nation. It's just, of course, just picture in your mind an authoritarian country and the education system in an authoritarian country. It's just telling students to love their country.
Well, it's mythic.
It's mythic.
It's not true.
Right. It creates a fake version of the past, and it tells students that you're the greatest country in history and your leaders are the greatest people in history. It's exactly what Hitler in Mein Kampf said the education system of the Third Reich should be.
And that's what it's been in the UK historically. You had ladybooks from the 1950s to the 1980s. Just this sanitized whitewashing of history where America, UK's great. We ended slavery. We brought civilization to the uncivilized, and we are a uniquely civilizing force, even though we create some of the most violent, chaotic situations on the planet. We are the good guys. We're exceptionally good. We bring law and order, even though we kind of legalized unlawfulness in many of these countries. We're the good guys. We are this. We bring democracy and civilization. Insane.
I talk about that at length. Hitler talks a lot about education in Mein Kampf. One of the fuel for fascist movements is this feeling of resentment by the dominant group. And so what you want to do is you want to create fear and resentment among the dominant group. So they keep supporting you and they think you're going to protect them. So you say there's this so you instead of so you represent another perspective, the perspective of marginalized groups, as as somehow an attack on the identity of the dominant group. So you say, like AfD in Germany, they want to say uh, one of their platforms, Bjorn Höcke's platform, is to one of the leaders is to remove the monument to the murdered Jews of Europe from Berlin, because the idea is all that history is there to make the dominant group feel shame. Which it's not. It's there just to remind people, let's not do this again. But the idea is but it is powerful for a non-Jewish German to see the Stolpersteiner.
And it's like the same situation in the UK. I know I keep saying the UK, but when we talk about history, our colonial history, our racist past, our racist present, they get so het up. It's like, oh, you're trying to make us feel guilty. What? No, we don't talk about science that way. Oh, like chemistry. Oh, gravity's making you feel guilty. No, we need to talk about this history and objective. We don't talk about the monarchy in that way, or any part of history. You don't go like, oh, talking about Henry VIII and how horrible he was. You're making me feel guilty for how he killed all his wives. No, we don't do that. Why are you so threatened by the truth of our past? We need to acknowledge it. But they can't because they're so fragile. And they're like, oh, because that means then you have to change the present and the future. And they don't want to do that. They don't want to do that.
To see the monuments that very recently have been placed on German streets. And it does generate powerful feelings. And what they're trying to do is leverage those powerful feelings into fear and resentment. When Musk said to the AfD, the most extreme far right party in Europe, that other far right parties won't work with, when Musk said, the German tribes were great, he didn't mean German Jews. He meant he was feeding into a myth of Aryanism, of Aryan supremacy, and he was feeding into the AfD line that German soldiers in World War I and World War II were in fact heroes. So this idea that what you try to do is you erase the history, and then you represent the dominant group as great, and then you represent history itself, the actual history, as a threat, as some sort of nefarious threat to destroy the nation.
And that is fundamental to what's happening in places like Colombia, because you're pushing out all sorts of people who challenge the dominant narrative. Of course, the primary group that's targeted now are people who challenge the Zionist narrative. But that's not exclusive. They're hardly interested in stopping with Zionism.
No, I think this attack on the universities is anti-Semitic, because the universities, first of all, it's placing us American Jews at the center of things. So the American university system is the greatest university system in the world, and they're using American Jews as the excuse to dismantle. So it's never good to be used politically like that. And it's billions and billions of dollars in federal funding. So and of course, who are the leftist protesters and critical intellectuals and among the students and faculty? Well, one group of them are obviously Jews. They're using anti-Semitic stereotypes of the university as filled with these dangerous leftist radicals. Those are anti-Semitic stereotypes, and they're using those to say we have to protect the Jews against it. Anti-Semitism just means leftism for them. They're just saying the left is anti-Semitic. But what this does is it sets Jewish people up. It sets Jewish people up. It feeds into the anti-Semitic stereotypes that Jews control the institutions. So it's hard for me not to see this, ironically and paradoxically, as an attack on American Jews.
Well,
Oh, massively. And that's the irony of the situation. The far right in America, J.D. Vance, Trump, they don't care about Israel. They don't care about Jews. It's just a means to attack the left, which, broadly speaking, in America, a good amount of them are moderate or leftist. So, yeah, it's genuinely depressing situation where people are cynically weaponizing anti-Semitism and bashing the universities, the left, in the cause of Israel, which is a far right ethno state, but they support that. It's insane. It is a fascist state. Netanyahu is a fascist. They like that. But they don't care about Jewish people, certainly not American Jews. And they don't care about the institutions of the university because they're trying to undermine them at every point because they are fascist.
You know, philo-Semitism is as insidious as anti-Semitism.
Yeah, but this isn't philo-Semitism even then because we're on both sides of this issue. As
Well,
long
that's true, but within the narrative.
within the narrative, absolutely, within the narrative, yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then, of course, the mainstream media has been preparing the ground, has been dupes for fascism, has been preparing the ground for the attacks on universities since 2015, since the Kochs and started this right-wing attack on universities for free speech. So it was like, so the editorial pages of the New York Times were concerned trolling about leftists on campus, repeatedly feeding into the propaganda that free speech was threatened by leftists on campus. And then suddenly last year it was like, okay, there's too much free speech because criticism of Israel. So, but the mainstream media did all that. They did all that work for authoritarian.
Which just shows you they don't care about freedom of speech. They always say it, that's the top narrative. It's immigration, freedom of speech. But not for the left. Like, you can't criticize Israel. Like, that seems to like the thing. Can't criticize what's happening in Israel, the genocide of Gaza. No. Like, how dare you protest it? Even on a university, the site of protest and discourse and discussion about politics. No. Like, people are being disappeared to El Salvador and other places. This is fascism. But people are in denial about it because they see fascism as this thing that happened in the 20th century. It's concentration camps. But this is a process. And fascism in the 21st century is very different to what it was in the 20th century. It's much more subtle. It's a war of misinformation. It's the culture war. It's consolidation of power by the wealthy. Like, it's not the same. And that's why it is hard to convince people who buy into these narratives because it isn't the same as it was in the past.
Very innocent.
Yeah, that's an important point, which you make. You write the nations. You're writing about Germany. You're writing about so the German culture, Weimar.
Actually, paradoxically, it's exactly the same, but there's material conditions and technology and the world. It's actually very the same, but will it lead to concentration? Because that's what people believe. Like, the Holocaust or fascism is concentration camps. That's a part of it, but there's way more other elements. Anti-university, patriarchal, nationalism, this erasure of history. It's more complicated than that. But we've just been led to believe that, oh, these people are evil, which kind of discredits any analysis of like why and how fascism comes about. It's a bit more complicated than, oh, they're just bad people.
Our Germany had a robust culture, a robust university system, and it very, as you note in the book, very swiftly disintegrated. You write the nation's self-understanding of its history and identity, preserved through its schools and its culture, was proven to be far less protective than many believed. So that very swift disintegration, which was also true, by the way, in the former Yugoslavia, brotherhood and unity and Tito and all this kind of stuff, it really crumbled with frightening rapidity. And that, I think, was a very important warning.
Absolutely. The school, for some reason, the schools, taking over the schools with patriotic education, with, just blather about how great the nation is, has a very dramatic and very quick effect for some reason. The Nazi takeover of the schools had an immediate drastic effect on German attitudes on non-Jewish German attitudes towards Jews, or the majority German attitudes towards Jews. Germany became very rapidly much more anti-Semitic than, for example, France, which, as we all know, or many of, as you should know, was the anti-Semitic country for a long time there. So the now there's a concerning point about Weimar and National Socialism, the National Socialist regime that superseded it, which is that the textbooks in Weimar Germany were already very nationalist. They already spent a lot of time talking about the greatness of the German nation. So the Nazis didn't need to do much. They already had a basis of a case in the textbooks that Germany was the greatest country in history, etc., etc. Look at our education system. Our education system, at least the one I was raised in, also said the United States is the greatest country in history. It also said the United States is the natural heir to Greece and Rome. It said the things that were exceptionalist narratives about the country that you had to accept. And so that really prepares the way for a fascist story that this is the greatest nation in history. We deserve, that's why we have so much power. We deserve to crush others because we are the best.
And it's the same in the UK. It's a lot more subtle in the UK. We're more moderate, we're more restrained in our nationalism, but it's there. And that's what Reform UK and Nigel Farage want. They want education to sow this pride of being British. Like, Britain's great. Western civilization should be celebrated, not criticized, not in their eyes demeaned because we want to explore the history and talk about it. How fragile can you get? And fascism is fragile inherently. It's contradictory, it's incoherent, and because it's so anti intellectual, their analysis is flawed. That's why you see Donald Trump now. Tariffs aren't going to work, they're going to make everything expensive, they're going to probably lead to his downfall. The same with Elon Musk as well. He thinks he's popular. He's one of the most hated men in America, if not the planet, because of his actions, his ideology. People don't like it. But to them, they're the great guys. They're the good guys doing God's work or whatever. Whereas we know it's blatant power, it's blatant money. That's all they care about. And it inevitably leads to a downfall.
You have an interesting, we'll come to it later, an interesting point about the misuse of classics,
Yeah.
which I studied.
Yeah.
But just to make this final point on that issue, you said that authoritarians, the reason they create these patriotic, mythic narratives is to leave students with the impression that the status quo has never been and cannot be challenged.
Yeah. So this is what folks like philosophy of education through the 20th century, folks from Dewey, the less radical version, to Freire, emphasize that education should be about agency. So an education system should give people the sense that they have agency to change history. And if you want to impose patriotic education, you want to impose the kind of education that fits into an authoritarian system, you want to remove agency from people. You want to excise the references to social movements for positive change. You want to make people feel that it's all great leaders from the dominant group. It's great men who do everything. And you're just a passive observer to history. So this is, when you teach philosophy of education, like I do, I teach the philosophy of education course at Yale, progressive education is all about giving citizens in a democracy a sense of agency. Authoritarian education is all about removing that sense of agency, erasing the history of social movements. Most recently, they're focusing on erasing Black Lives Matter as if it never happened. So Florida, you can't mention it's being excised from textbooks, even under recent events. So this is obviously in China. You can't talk about the Tiananmen Square protests. So this move to excise agents, it's a move to excise agency, because democracy is about agency.
And again, we see this in the UK. We don't really have this. I mean, going back to John Dewey, where he spoke about how education was about creating democracy and engaged populace who are informed, active, and knowledgeable about geopolitical history, etc. Now we don't even talk about education in the UK as having real utility. Like, what is education for? It's just assumed that it's to create labor and a certain level of workers. Doesn't really engage. It may virtue signal to certain things like well-being and fun and engagement, but not really in terms of what kind of people are we producing? What is the reason and endpoint of education today? We don't talk about it, like, and the future as well. We just, again, what is it? Because when you just slip into that complacency, like, oh, it's obviously to just make people literate enough to work a typical job, as opposed to be civically engaged. Because Paulo Freire spoke about this. Like, we need to create people that challenge the system, because the system doesn't work, democracy doesn't work, if you don't have an engaged population who challenge history, the media, the politicians. I mean, the idea that we live in a world where somehow Trump is the anti-establishment guy and Nigel Farage is, that is a lack of education. Like, you can't come to that conclusion if you actually know anything about these guys and what they represent and where they come from and what power and interests they work for. You can't. You just can't. So our education is built to not really educate. And that's pretty depressing, because that's how you capture ideologies. That's why we're in the place we are, where people can't challenge the system because they've not had that, they've not been educated to think critically about, okay, why does the system work like it is and how can we change it?
Well, it also, all of the openings within society, Howard Zinn makes this point, People's History of the United States, is that it's achieved by movements, but in this mythic version, it's a gift from benevolent leaders.
Right,
It's a
exactly.
gift from Roosevelt. It's a gift from Lincoln. It's even a gift from Nixon.
That's a great man narrative that I was referring to. And Zinn, of course, people's history is this great, critique of that has had a history from below that's had an enormous impact. And as a result, Trump actually singled out Howard Zinn's book in 2020 or 2021, whenever he gave the patriotic education executive order, I believe. I think it was an executive order. He denounced Howard Zinn's propaganda because, of course, he did.
Yeah, like the idea that Donald Trump has read Howard Zinn is hilarious.
You write, history is the study of not just people and events, but also the practices, structures, and institutions that shape them. Without accounting for these forces, history is rendered flat and malleable, ideal for manipulation by fascist politics. When fascists attempt to rewrite history, they sometimes claim that they are erasing only theories and interpretations of history which they claim to be biased, rather than underlying historical events, but they know well that their interventions result in the erasure of events themselves, as well as the patterns they form. That attack on bias, I mean, of course, the irony is that the attackers could not be more biased, but it works.
Yeah, it works. Yeah. I mean, it works even though it's flagrantly absurd, because they themselves are saying we want to replace supposed bias and indoctrination by patriotic education. What the hell is patriotic education? Just means indoctrination to love your country.
Yeah.
So, it's literally, it's nonsensical. Also, they're bringing in Christian nationalism, and they're representing Christianity as the unbiased position. So, Christian, obviously this is your territory, but one of your territories, but they're representing Christian nationalism and patriotism and sort of deep patriotism lessons as unbiased, and actually looking at the history, saying, like, these are the social movements that happen. This is why you have the weekend. This they're representing as indoctrination. It goes further than that, because if you closely read the Dear Colleagues letter of, I believe, February 10th or February 14th, directed to universities about Title VI, it really looks like even teaching basic facts about Black history, such as the way banks were designed to discriminate against Black borrowers, the lending system, or school segregation, it looks like that is going to count as school-on-student harassment.
I want to talk about this when I wrote my book on.
We'll end there. And it's interesting you talk about how often the right, Jordan Peterson does this all the time, like the left is captured by ideology, he's not ideological in any way, and then has a very clear ideology. And they always present like these far right talking points: nationalism, love the country, education should be building pride and love of England, America. This isn't natural. It's not inevitable. The nation state is a couple of hundred years old. Allegiance to the nation, uh, unable to deal with our difficult pasts. None of this is inevitable. And it, like you say, it's nonsensical. Like, oh, you can't teach history. We need to teach nationalist pride. That's an ideology. But to them, it's like, oh, well, it's a good ideology. And that means you can't criticize it because that's just inevitable, isn't it? That's how we've done it. We've always done it that way. But we haven't. If you look at history, we haven't. So I'll end there. Go and watch the rest of the interview. It's really interesting. They go into more points on erasure of history and fascism. Hit the like button, and I'll see you in the next video.